They never spoke to him. They never touched him. And that is how they earned his trust. How do you tame a creature whose heart is a fortress of fear? You don't. You just sit outside the walls and wait. The fear was a living thing. It had claws that dug into his heart and teeth that gnawed at his bones. Cody did not know a world without it. He knew the cold, hard-packed dirt of the enclosure floor. He knew the scent of pine needles on the wind. And he knew the towering, silent shapes of the humans who came and went. They were two of them, a man and a woman. They moved with a slowness that felt like a trap. Their quiet was a threat. In a world Cody had known before, quiet meant a predator was stalking. Loud noises meant violence. These humans were an unnerving mix of both. His body was a map of past pains. A jagged scar ran down his left flank, a permanent reminder of a fight he barely survived. His ears were notched. His spirit was broken into 1,000 sharp pieces. He spent his days pressed into the farthest corner of the large, fenced-in space, a den he had dug beneath the roots of an old oak tree. From there, he watched. The man was named Arthur. He was tall and broad, with hands that looked strong enough to snap a branch in two. His face was lined like the bark of a tree, and his eyes were a calm, steady blue. The woman was Eleanor. She was softer, rounder, and moved with a gentle sway. Her hair was the color of snow. They never tried to approach him. This was the first rule they made. It was the foundation of everything. Each morning, just after the sun's first light touched the valley, they would appear. Eleanor would carry a bucket of fresh, clean water. Arthur would carry a bowl of food. They would unlatch the gate, their movements careful and deliberate. Cody would retreat deeper into his hole, a low growl vibrating in his chest. It was a sound of pure terror, not aggression. They would place the water and food just inside the gate, a safe distance away. Then they would retreat and latch the gate behind them. They never looked at his den. They never called to him. They did not try to coax him out. After placing the provisions, they would do the strangest thing. They would simply stay. Arthur would bring a small, three-legged stool and a block of wood. He would sit just outside the fence and begin to whittle. The soft scrape of his knife on the wood became a new sound in Cody's world. It was steady. It was predictable. It was not threatening. Eleanor would bring a rocking chair and a book. She would sit beside her husband, the gentle creak of the chair a soft rhythm. Sometimes she would just look out at the mountains, her hands resting in her lap. They would sit for an hour, sometimes two. They did not speak much. They simply existed. They shared the space with him, but made no demands. For Cody, whose life had been a series of violent demands, this was incomprehensible. Days bled into weeks. The routine never changed. Sunup, gate opens, food and water. Gate closes. The man whittles. The woman rocks. The sun climbs higher. They leave. Cody started to learn their sounds. The crunch of their boots on the gravel path. The soft click of the gate latch. The whisper of pages turning. The scrape of the knife. These sounds were not followed by pain. They were followed by a bowl of food he would sneak out to eat only when the world was silent again. They were followed by a bucket of water that washed the dust from his throat. Fear was still his constant companion, but a new feeling began to sprout in the barren ground of his heart. It was a tiny, fragile thing. It was called curiosity. He started to watch them more closely from the shadows of his den. The man's hands were large, but they were gentle with the wood. The woman's face was soft when she looked at the sky. He was still afraid. He was still broken. But for the first time in a long, long time, he did not feel like he was about to die. He felt watched over. The two quiet humans were like ancient, unmoving trees. They were just there. Their presence was becoming a strange kind of safety. The foundation was being laid, one silent morning at a time. The seasons began to turn. The sharp bite of late autumn gave way to the deep cold of winter. Snow fell, blanketing the valley in a thick layer of white. The silence was deeper now. The world felt muffled and slow. Cody's routine with the Millers continued, a single, warm thread in the cold fabric of the world. One morning, something new was added to the ritual. After Eleanor placed the water bowl down, she remained standing by the fence for a moment, and she began to hum. It was not a song with words. It was just a sound, a low, soft, melodic vibration that carried on the frosty air. Cody's ears, so attuned to the snap of a twig or the cry of a distant bird, swiveled forward. His head lifted from the dirt floor of his den. What was this? It was not a growl. It was not a cry of pain. It was gentle. He watched her, his amber eyes wide with suspicion. But she did not move closer. She just hummed for a minute, a simple, looping melody, before rejoining Arthur by the fence. She did it again the next day, and the next. The humming became part of the morning. It was as predictable as the food and water. Cody found himself waiting for it. The sound seemed to smooth out the jagged edges of his fear, just for a moment. It was an invitation, offered with no expectation of a response. A week later, Arthur brought something new. It was a small wooden box. He sat on his stool, held it in his large, calloused hands, and turned a tiny crank on its side. A delicate, tinkling music filled the air. It was the sound of tiny bells, a stark contrast to the vast, quiet landscape. Cody crept to the edge of his den. The music was strange, magical. It pulled at his curiosity. He watched Arthur's hands turn the crank, his head tilted. The man was not looking at him. He was looking at the music box, a small smile on his face. He played the tune twice, then put the box away and picked up his whittling. The invitations kept coming, always passive, always gentle. The food began to change. One day, alongside the usual dry meal, there was a chunk of warm, boiled chicken. The smell was intoxicating. It made his mouth water. He waited until they were long gone before he darted out, snatched the prize, and retreated to his den to devour it. The next day, it was a piece of roasted beef, still juicy and rich. Then a hard-boiled egg. These were not just offerings of sustenance. They were offerings of pleasure. They were small luxuries, tiny signals that these humans saw him as more than just a creature to be kept alive. They were trying to give him something good. Cody began to change. He still slept in his den, but he spent more of the daylight hours lying just outside of it, his nose pointed toward the fence, toward the two humans. He would watch them for the entire time they were there. He learned the way Arthur squinted when he was studying a piece of wood. He learned the way Eleanor's shoulders relaxed when she found a passage in her book that she liked. He was no longer just an animal in a cage. He was an observer. He was a student of their quiet kindness. The wall of his fear had been built of solid, heavy stones. Now, with each hummed tune, with each tinkling melody, with each delicious morsel, they were not trying to tear the wall down. They were simply offering him flowers to grow in the cracks. They were inviting him to see that the world on the other side of the wall might be safe. They were asking for nothing in return. And because they asked for nothing, they were slowly, gently being offered everything. Spring arrived like a whispered promise. The snow melted, feeding the creeks until they sang. Green shoots pushed their way through the damp earth. The air grew warmer, carrying the scent of soil and new life. Cody felt the change in his own body. His thick winter coat began to shed. He felt lighter. His internal landscape was changing, too. The constant, high-pitched hum of fear had faded to a low thrum. It was still there, but it no longer dominated his every waking moment. The predictable kindness of the Millers had built a fortress of routine around him, and inside that fortress, a new feeling was taking root: trust. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning. It was bright and clear. Arthur and Eleanor went through their usual ritual: water, food. Then they settled into their spots outside the fence. But today, Cody did something different. Instead of staying by his den, he stood up. He stretched, his long body unfolding. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked to the center of the enclosure and lay down. He was in the open. He was exposed, but he was also closer to them than he had ever been before. He rested his head on his paws, and watched them. Eleanor saw the movement from the corner of her eye. Her breath caught in her throat. She nudged Arthur gently with her elbow. He stopped his whittling and looked. His eyes widened slightly, but his expression remained calm. They did not speak. They did not point. They did not acknowledge the monumental step he had just taken. They simply accepted it. They continued their quiet sitting, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. For Cody, their lack of reaction was the most profound reaction of all. They were not excited by his progress like a trainer taming a beast. They were simply content with his presence. He had chosen to move closer, and they had honored his choice by not making a fuss. They were letting him set the pace. He learned that their presence was a comfort. When a logging truck rumbled down the distant road, a sound that would have once sent him scrambling for his hole, he now just lifted his head and looked toward the porch. Seeing them sitting there, calm and unbothered, soothed him. He was learning to read their cues. If they were calm, he could be calm, too. The real test came during a late spring thunderstorm. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray. The wind whipped through the valley, making the trees groan. A crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a clap of thunder so loud it shook the ground. Cody's instinct screamed. His body went rigid, and a whine of pure terror escaped his throat. The old fear came rushing back, a tidal wave of panic. He scrambled to his feet, pacing the fence line, his tail tucked hard between his legs. The storm was chaos. It was violence. It was everything he had ever feared. He ran toward his den, seeking the familiar safety of the dark earth. But he stopped. He looked back toward the cabin. Arthur and Eleanor had not run inside. They were still on their covered porch, watching the rain. They were not afraid. A powerful new instinct warred with his terror. He was afraid of the storm, but he was no longer afraid of them. In his panicked mind, a connection was made. They were safety. The storm was danger. He needed to be closer to safety. He turned away from his den and trotted to the part of the fence closest to the porch. He huddled there, his body trembling, the rain plastering his fur to his skin. He whined, a soft, pleading sound. He was not hiding from them. He was hiding with them. He watched them through the storm. They sat quietly, a beacon of calm in a world gone mad. They were his anchor. He had chosen them. He had watched them. And he had finally, truly, accepted that these strange, quiet humans were a source of profound security, not fear. The acceptance was not just in his mind. It was in his bones. The morning after the storm was glorious. The air was washed clean, and every leaf and blade of grass glittered with leftover raindrops. The sun was warm on Cody's back. The terror of the storm had passed, leaving behind a new, settled quiet in his soul. He had faced his fear, and he had not been alone. He lay near the fence, dozing in the sun, when he heard the familiar soft click of the gate latch. It was Eleanor. She came in with a water bucket, just as she did every morning. She moved with her usual unhurried grace, her steps soft on the damp ground. Cody opened his eyes and watched her. Something was different today. The last barrier inside him, the final wall of reservation, had crumbled during the storm. He no longer saw her as a potential threat. He saw her as Eleanor, his Eleanor. She bent down to swap the old water bowl for the new one. Her back was to him. She did not look over her shoulder. She trusted him not to startle, not to react with fear. Slowly, Cody pushed himself to his feet. His heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. He took one step, then another. He walked directly toward her. He was not hesitant. He was not fearful. He was certain. Arthur, watching from his stool on the porch, held his breath. His hands, usually so busy with his knife and wood, were still. He gripped the edge of his seat. This was it. This was the moment all their patience had been for. Eleanor heard the soft padding of his paws on the earth behind her. She did not flinch. She did not turn around quickly. She finished her task, placing the full water bowl down, and then she slowly, calmly, straightened up. She stood perfectly still, waiting. Cody stopped right beside her. He was so close, she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He lowered his head and gently nudged her hand with his cold, wet nose. It was a simple, curious touch. A question. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. A tear slipped down her cheek. She still didn't move. She let him be the one to decide what came next. And then he did it. He took a small step closer and pressed the side of his broad, furry head firmly against her leg. He leaned into her, a solid, trusting weight. It was an act of complete surrender, an act of profound vulnerability. He was offering physical contact, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation. I trust you. I am yours. The wiry texture of his fur, the solidness of his skull against her thigh, the warmth of his body. It was the most beautiful feeling Eleanor had ever known. All the months of patience, of quiet sitting, of humming and gentle offerings had led to this. Slowly, so slowly as not to break the spell, she raised her hand. She hesitated for a fraction of a second above his head, then gently placed it between his ears. His fur was thick and soft. He did not pull away. He did not even flinch. Instead, he leaned in her touch, pushing his head up slightly into her palm. He closed his eyes. A soft sob escaped Eleanor's lips. She rested her other hand on his strong back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He was real. He was here, and he was safe. From the porch, Arthur watched, his vision blurred by his own tears. He saw his wife and the wild creature they had come to love, standing together in the morning sun. It wasn't a victory. It was a gift. The bond was no longer just an idea they were hoping for. It was real. It was a solid, living thing. It had been confirmed not with words, but with a simple, trusting touch. From that day forward, everything was different. The bond, once a fragile seedling, grew into the strong, central trunk of Cody's new life. The gate to the enclosure was often left open now. He never ran. The entire homestead, the cabin, the porch, the workshop, the garden, had become his territory, his home. A new rhythm settled over their lives, one that now fully included him. His days were woven into the fabric of theirs. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding affection. His mornings no longer began with suspicion, but with anticipation. He would wait on the porch, and when Arthur opened the cabin door, Cody would greet him with a low, happy woof, a sound he had never made before. His tail, once held low and still, would give a few slow, powerful wags. He had developed a special connection with Arthur. The man's quiet, steady nature seemed to mirror a part of Cody's own soul. When Arthur went to his workshop to whittle, Cody would follow. He would lie on the cool concrete floor at Arthur's feet, his head resting on the man's worn leather boot. Sometimes, Arthur would reach down, not even looking, and scratch the thick fur on Cody's neck. Cody would sigh, a sound of pure contentment, and the scrape, scrape, scrape of the whittling knife would be his lullaby. With Eleanor, the affection was more expressive. She talked to him constantly, her voice a soft murmur as she worked in her garden or sat on the porch. She bought a special brush with stiff bristles, and every afternoon, they had a grooming ritual. Cody would stand patiently, leaning into her as she worked through the tangles in his thick coat, pulling out the last of his winter undercoat. He would close his eyes in bliss, grunting softly with pleasure. He, who had once flinched at the thought of a human hand, now actively sought it out. He became a full member of their small pack. When they sat on the porch in the evenings to watch the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and pink, he would lie between their chairs. Often, he would rest his heavy head in Arthur's lap while Eleanor's hand rested on his back, her fingers gently stroking his fur. He was their bridge, connecting them in a circle of shared, silent love. He had his quirks. He was fascinated by the fat, buzzing bumblebees in Eleanor's lavender bushes, watching them for hours. He disliked the mail carrier's truck with a passion, letting out a single, sharp bark whenever it rumbled past the end of their long driveway. He loved the taste of the wild blackberries that grew along the fence line, delicately picking them off the bushes with his front teeth. These were the small, wonderful details of a life being truly lived, not just survived. The scar on his flank was still there, a pale line against his gray fur, but it was just a mark now, not the definition of his existence. His past was a shadow, but he now lived entirely in the light. One cool autumn evening, a year after he had first arrived, the three of them were on the porch. A gentle breeze rustled the golden leaves of the aspen trees. Cody was lying between them, half asleep. Arthur reached down and absently stroked his head. Cody's eyes opened. He looked up at Arthur, and for a moment, their gazes locked. In those amber depths, there was no fear, no hesitation. There was only peace. There was only love. He lifted his head from Arthur's lap, shifted his body, and rested it on Eleanor's feet instead, letting out a long, happy sigh. He was home. He was loved. He was whole. The patient, quiet kindness of two good people had not just saved his life. It had given him one worth living. The fruition of their efforts was not in his obedience, but in the simple, heartwarming peace of a shared sunset.